Mr. Speaker, this bill, in one sweep, takes away the protection created by the framers of the Constitution to insulate the police from the political directorate. And Mr. Speaker, this bill is ultra-virus to the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago. The government is creating a supplemental police service outside the constitutional checks and balances of the Police Service Commission's structure. Mr. Speaker, Section 123A, 1 and 2 of the Constitution states that, and I quote, "The Commissioner of Police shall have the complete power to manage the police service and is required to ensure that the human, financial, and material resources available to the service are used in an efficient and effective manner," end of quote. Number 2 states, "The Commissioner of Police shall have the power to," and I quote, A, "appoint persons to hold or act in an office in the police service other than an officer referred to in Section 123(1)A, including the power to make appointments on promotion and to confirm appointments." And it goes on to talk about transfer and to remove from office and exercise disciplinary control. So, Mr. Speaker, the power to appoint persons to act in an office in the police service rests with the Commissioner of Police, as stated in the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago. The transfer of powers, therefore, cannot be done in the fashion that the government intends to do. Where in all these amendments does it say that the defense force cannot exercise police powers except in the presence of the police? Because, Mr. Speaker, I was reliably informed that, as a matter of fact, the defense force has been out working without the police. And I want them to tell me that that is not true. Policemen are being used as drivers for members of the defense force, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister mentioned that the members of the defense force will be trained. Mr. Speaker, we are all aware that there are many police officers who are fully trained, and there are still many problems with their performance. So, Mr. Speaker, is this a plan to make mermaids out of members of the defense force? How long is this training expected to take place? Mr. Speaker, I am aware that the training for Special Reserve policemen is supposed to last for at least 6 weeks, and that's in the basics. I recently spoke to a person who is a specialist trainer of the police who felt that the defense force officers should be trained in the following areas: in knowledge of the law, investigative interviewing, suspect and witness interviewing, managing and preserving crime scenes, forensic awareness, including the handling of DNA evidence, statements and report writing, dealing with major and critical incidents, integrity, giving evidence in court and industrial court processes, among other topics. Mr. Speaker, I also met with an individual who conducted investigative training in the police service, and this course was attended by members of the military as well. Mr. Speaker, the tutor stated that the majority of the military personnel who attended the course found difficulty with the course content, especially in the statement, report and writing area. And this is, of course, no disrespect to the military personnel. Mr. Speaker, you see, because of the mere nature of the differing roles, most of the military personnel experience difficulty in grasping the basic concepts of policing. And Mr. Speaker, I did not say that. A certified police trainer said that. Did the government take into consideration the re-socialization of the members of the defense force? Was that taken into consideration? Because, of course, the culture of the police service and the culture of defense force is totally different, Mr. Speaker, and it is not easy changing culture. I am informed that there were many problems during the state of emergency, and part of the reason for this is that the members of the defense force and the police are socialized differently. The state could be faced with many lawsuits if members of the defense force are given the powers of the police with inadequate training. How long does the minister intend to train them for? And we haven't heard a figure, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if a police constable is out with a member of the defense force who is engaged in assisting him, and that person is a sergeant, but yet the constable will be more okra with what is supposed to be done on the street, who is in charge, Mr. Speaker? The police constable? Mr. Speaker, A perusal of the Defense Act, Chapter 1401, shows that the Defense Force system is different to that of the police. Will these police powers now include the right to representation by the Police Social and Welfare Association? Will members of the Defense Force now have rights to be represented, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force is now being opened to trade unionism. And this is a movement that grows due to adversity. If they have powers equal to the police, this gives them equal powers to seek representation, Mr. Speaker. Is this what we want in our defense force? Mr. Speaker, they cannot be denied representation when they are engaged to assist the police, who have legal rights to representation. So therefore, the members of the defense force need representation too, if that is the case. Many persons join the Army or the Coast Guard because they do not want to be a police officer, and vice versa. Why must their rights be infringed upon by conferring the powers of the police on them? What is being said to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Speaker, is that if you want to be a police officer, join the Army. Mr. Speaker, will the members of the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force now have access to overtime? This question needs to be answered, because the police get overtime. With members who now have police powers, will they be getting overtime? Part of the privileges of a police officer engaged in law and order is negotiated compensation packages. So are we saying that the soldiers will now be able to negotiate their packages? Mr. Speaker, I would like to raise some fundamental concerns about the proposed amendment and broaden the discussion to the functioning of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. We are overly concerned, given the high incidence of complaints by citizens of excessive physical force used and brutality inflicted on many innocent civilians by both the police and the military. I recently read a newspaper report of alleged police and soldier brutality in the Immigration Detention Center. Don't know the reason, I don't know the facts, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, for many years in the Murray polls, the military was consistently viewed by the population as the most respected and trusted agency within national security. And we do not wish to see this eroded. And you just have to check the Murray polls and see what the citizens think about soldiers. Mr. Speaker, past chiefs of defense staff and several senior military officers have been overly concerned about soldiers being increasingly exposed to a degree of indiscipline that is not in keeping with the military's philosophy and tradition. And we know that the military is defined as an organization authorized by its greater society to use lethal force, usually including the use of weapons, in defending its country against threats to our democracy. So, Mr. Speaker, we are aware that members of the Defense Force can provide various services, such as counterterrorism, hostage rescue, border security, defending the country from external threats presented by illegal smuggling of guns, drugs, and ammunition, and other goods into our country. The military can be used to protect and defend critical infrastructure from criminals and criminal activity. In a number of these roles, they are aiding the civil power. And we have a military of whom we are proud. Who can forget the outstanding role of the military in 1990, which the member for Oakwood East alluded to, when our constitution and our democracy were under threat, and the military performed the role for which it was brought into service. The role was to stand as a first line of defense against external aggression and to safeguard the country against internal subversion. They did that in 1990, Mr. Speaker, and that is the military we have. That is the military we want. That is the military that the PNM is determined to preserve. We will not seek to destroy a military that has the confidence of the population, as reflected in the Murray polls. The government is seeking to destroy that, Mr. Speaker. Who can forget that dramatic announcement on July the 27th, 1990, summoning members of the defense force to gather during a finals football match in the stadium, Mr. Speaker. They did not know why, but in obedience, they assembled. Vehicles were commanded to take them to Camp Octen, Mr. Speaker. So began the fight to preserve our democracy. We are concerned, Mr. Speaker, as to whether the plan is to use the military to fulfill a political agenda of this government. Mr. Speaker, military leaders in many countries have closely guarded the use of soldiers for policing. Soldiers need to maintain a level of tempo and cadence that is far different to that of a police officer. And Mr. Speaker, in effect, we are putting our military in a situation, in a position where they are neither fish nor fowl. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Minister mentioned that several public officers have been given police duties and cited Section 3 of the Customs Act, Chapter 7801, which provides for customs officer. Mr. Speaker, what the minister did not say is that Section 64, Chapter 7801 of the Customs Act states that when customs officers carry out their search, they have the powers of the police, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, this refers to a defined objective, only when they have to search, Mr. Speaker. So, in essence, it is not a blank check. The Army is meant to enhance and to complement the law enforcement efforts of the police by providing much-needed manpower from specially selected Army personnel. Mr. Speaker, we do not have a situation of terrorism and sectarian violence in Trinidad and Tobago. What we have is a crime problem which must be addressed by the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. And we need to ensure that the current legislative instruments and supporting regulations are absent of legal loopholes. Or is it that the larger issue here is that this government has lost faith in the police service and its leadership, hence the need for this legislation? Mr. Speaker, I just want to give an example of something that took place in Chicago, USA recently. And I urge the Minister of National Security to closely examine the crime situation in Chicago, a city with a population of 2.7 million, twice that of Trinidad and Tobago. Note, in the United States, and the Minister mentioned this legislation, the Posse Comitatus Act and the Insurrection Act substantially limit the powers of the federal government to use the military for law enforcement. And Mr. Speaker, the Posse Comitatus Act 1887 intent, in concert with the Insurrection Act of 1807, was to limit the powers of the federal government in using federal military personnel to enforce the state laws. It prohibits most members of the federal uniformed services from exercising nominally state law enforcement police or police officer powers that maintain law and order on non-federal property. So the mayor of Chicago did not ask for the U.S. Army or the National Guard. Instead, with 44 murders in January 2013, we are talking about this year, Mr. Speaker, 44 murders, Mayor Rahm Emanuel realized his mistake and resurrected the tactical teams of officers designed to break up gang activity and move 200 cops from desk jobs to the street, Mr. Speaker. And the result was a 50-year low of 14 murders in February last month. These 14 homicides represented a more than 50% decrease from the 30 homicides in February 2012. Mr. Speaker, the Minister acknowledges the upsurge in serious crime has been fueled by the development of gang warfare and gang-related violence. And Mr. Speaker, this government rushed to dismantle the Repeat Offenders Task Force, which was responsible for dealing with gang problems in hotspot areas. Additionally, instead of seeking to develop legislation to formalize and duly constitute the Special Anti-Crime Unit of Trinidad and Tobago, they dismantled this unit also. And if this is the sum total of the justification of the proposed measures that will be precipitated by the proclamation of this legislation, if passed in this House, then I beg to differ. And in so doing, I would like to quote from the Sunday Express of March 2nd, 2013. I quote money laundering expert David West.